I just had just a few thoughts, so prepare those questions as I talk. My name is Stephen Knott, and like Kat, who introduced today's lecture, I am on the Peter Dormer Lecture Committee, and I'm a lecturer in design history at Liverpool Hope University. I've just got just a few couple of comments that act as some kind of summary, or maybe some kind of invitation for further questions. And just going back to the beginning, we started with and throughout really, the beauty of mathematics. And I was immediately thinking that I should have, I did actually call my brother this morning, who is a whiz at maths and physics, he really should be standing here asking questions to really kind of push the beauty of mathematics. But alas, he was doing his own structural engineering of a tree in his garden. So I will give it an effort. I'll give it a good shot here. But we started with the Fibonacci sequence, and this idea of like just slightly changing geometries with which we are familiar. So slightly altering like the square, the rectangle, the circle, and this kind of the beauty that results from slightly tilting things to create new patterns away from the geometric format with which we are familiar. You mentioned from developing this the idea of scaleless ideas that kind of beam out to kind of massive patterns that you then seem to take a snapshot of, a square around a part of that pattern, usually the center, which creates the built form. That creates the architecture. And we can see how wonderful the results are looking at the Serpentine Pavilion, where you worked with Toyo Ito, and in the Selfridges project that you outline in Glasgow. This idea of how, by expanding out the slightly tilted geometrical pattern, you can come up with forms that you described as dancing columns, anything from that, to a whole load of other kind of patterns and devices that can be used very creatively in architecture, and as you said, sculpture, jewelry, and a whole range of things. Because very interestingly, you mentioned that this development, by working these numbers, you create scale-less ideas. I think that's rather fascinating. This leads to something that struck me, which is the idea that as a structural engineer, as a kind of artist, or, you know, I appreciate the kind of complete, there's no need to categorize that you started with. I think this is really useful when you create these networks and the networks decide almost what happens thereafter. The playing with numbers ends up coming up with patterns, infrastructures, and algorithms that then put you in a position of just really taking a snapshot of it rather than you coming up with the made thing. And that's a kind of interesting inversion of the usual way we think about craft. I thought that the combination of ornament, structure, and architecture all in one, this one unity, was a very poetic idea, and I think it really comes across in the bridge in Coimbra in Portugal, particularly that middle space that lies floating in between all this complex structural engineering. I think this idea of playing around with numbers and the amount of time you talked about numbers and almost working the number, just like a potter works a pot, was quite fascinating. So really almost putting these numbers to task. And I extracted from your lecture this quote, 6 is not just a classification, but a field condition. So it's like taking these numbers and really pushing them to work really hard. So you're kind of pushing pixels to behave in a way that we might easily see in pushing clay particles or wood. You're doing the same with numbers, which is really interesting and very fascinating to see, resulting in all those biomorphic forms that again can work as modular, jewelry, and architecture. And we ended on the sheer beauty of prime numbers, and this idea of using prime numbers graphically. Okay, so that's given a little bit of a summarization of a few key points. And one question before passing it over to the floor. I just wondered whether you mentioned in the talk there how you wanted your result to be produced in resin with colors coming through it. and you said that that was not possible yet. You've asked everyone. I wondered if there's other examples where the material that ends up manifesting the ideas that you create, or the structures that you decide to produce, if there are any other moments where the material says no and makes it difficult for you to present these ideas.
Well, in a very mundane way, the Serpentine Pavilion had a challenge in that you couldn't weld something like that easily. And I used to go up to Nottingham to the welder's shop, to the manufacturers, and they gave up on welding it because they'd start to weld it and it starts to creep up. And this very intricate network, how do you connect it all up? So there, in a very simple way, the making could compromise your design, though we got over that one. Generally, I think with experience, you avoid the traps of not making. I think you know what, because it's scaleless, the patterns are scaleless, they're therefore challenging. And so, in one sense, Jörg Jensen is talking to me about certain jewelry, if in different form. And at the other end, we're thinking of some of those modules could be a very big pavilion in Dubai. And I think so I then think of what material can come. And I think, to go back to your introductory questions, your summary, I stopped in a way doing engineering as you understand it about 25 years ago. But the training of 20 years was there. And so there's also another intuition working, a hidden one that you don't know about, that's making you take decisions that you know will come out okay and be buildable, though you have no idea what material. But when you have it, then you can also choose the material quite easily. Resin is the one I'm still chasing. I have been through America talking the very best. No one in England can do it. There will be someday one, because the numbers, what I haven't said is, they have qualities. They could be smell, velocity, color, heat, anything. They don't have to be objects. They could be heat sinks. They could be anything. And I was asked some years ago by, what's the guy, the famous chef? Hazel, Helmut, what's his name? Blumenthal, right. And he was commissioned to do a cooking thing at the Serpentine Pavilion. And we hired a smell scientist from Los Angeles. And I was thinking of making a number smell potpourri. Totally mad. But these things are all possible with the digital. You're not limited. That's the thing. People think, sadly, that somehow fine art cannot be touched by computer process. Somehow if you touch it, you dirty it, you soil it. I don't believe that at all. I believe we have a magical tool now to open our thinking, and actually used at the highest levels, it informs you back. It's an iterative process. It's not a clumsy mule. It can, in a sophisticated process, educate you too, and raise your instinct. What I'm doing now, I could never have done 20 years ago. By playing with this, I just got another intuition working. So you're picking and finding answers more readily.
Thank you very much. Has anyone got a question?
I also
Cecil?
want to say, I'm not a physicist, I'm not a mathematician. I think if your brother was here, or a mathematician, they would be appalled at the triviality of this stuff. It really is. It's absolute child's play for a mathematician.
It's fantastic to see number being applied, and in a big way. But I just wanted to wave this, because this is number being applied in the small way, because this is 2, 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 4, 2, 4. And the interesting thing, I think, is that it only got developed because, in Fair Isle, where people had to make over and over again, they had to repeat the process, and their constraints meant that it was only ever 2 colours at once. So there's something about the constraint as well as the coding, the number coding, that makes it really interesting. But it's been something that people have been fascinated with for
thank you for reminding me of that, because what I didn't tell you was part of the impetus for all of this was I wrote a little book called Number 9 in 98, I think. And the following year, one of my friends rang me and said, hey, they're discussing your book on the radio, Radio 4. I said, what? So I was chuffed, you know, oh, book's being reviewed or something. And there was a lady talking about knitting from my book. And yeah, I'd written the book as a kind of, I don't know, an enjoyment in numbers. It was just done. So I then started looking at the book and thinking, what is she making out of this? Where is she seeing this stuff? So then the next day, much to the embarrassment of my, I think by that 12 or 13-year-old daughter, I went to the shops and started buying all the knitting books. So I kept buying them up because I had no idea how knitting works. And I started looking at the stitch patterns. And I started realizing what she was doing was stitching some of the, I had circular rosette patterns. And there are sequences, 2, 4, 1, 2, all of that. And then from that I started looking at looms. And the books written in the 30s and 40s are fabulous, books on looms. And then I took that further into digital loom and worked with St. Martin's School of Design on a special textile through a loom, stitching it just with the numbers, which I couldn't show today.
Just very quickly on that relationship to textile, I noticed your project, is it called H_Edge?
Yes.
Yeah, the very famous project of chains and metal plates creating forms that was described by one critic as an exploded textile. I wondered if you could just maybe say just a bit about that in relationship to textile, the H.
Edge.
H_Edge.
So that was in Spitalfields. I don't know if you can see it with the lights, right in front of the Gherkin. And this is it's a sponge form. And here the numbers are not really driving. It's more classification 0 for void, 1 for solid. So binary, solid void. And I turned that all into aluminum plates that are sort of dancing plates with stainless steel chains that stand up. Counterintuitive to what you expect a chain to do. Nothing hangs here, it stands up. And it's rather beautiful. What did you say it was? An exploded?
Yeah, well, one critic called it an exploded textile or an exploded carpet.
Interesting. Well,
in the way that the kind of interlocking parts come together and create structure.
When you're in it, it does strange things to you because this is a fractal, again, though you can't see it that easily. And you are, it's a sieve, a modern sieve. You can look through this to the space outside, never denies the space outside. I built this in Chicago, different version, next to Louis Sullivan's ornaments in the same room. And nothing was taken away from Louis Sullivan. And this was it. It also held its own. So it's interesting because it has no border, no boundary. Wherever you look, it's open because it's a fractal. And I put it on a pool of water to reflect its kind of infinite progress. Yeah, I was very pleased with this thing. It's touring 3 continents. One's in America, one's Europe. It was in Florence last year. So 2 years ago, I think, and then last year in London. And there's one in Japan and Hong Kong. Different versions. It's like Anthony Gormley's field. You know, it can be taken down, put up, and I always have students build it. There's no skilled labor in this, except for one of my guys. It's true. It's just a jig. You stretch the chains, and you only have to have a torque wrench with 50-pound stretch. And then you just put the stuff in, release the torque, grips it all, stands up.
Thank you very much. Any other questions from the floor?
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. I guess my question was just really about all this talk about patterns and fractals, whether maybe you had been affected by seeing these patterns in other parts of your life, like your relationships or your age or the way you communicate things. Has this the work affected how you are as a person?
A personal question. Well, I mean, over the years, I've come to a belief that architecture with modernism lost its way and became soulless as we pursued the minimal. Some of it's beautiful, but after you get the all-glass box in 1942 with Philip Johnson, where do you go in architecture? Mies van der Rohe on Chicago Lake, and where do you go after the glass box? It's so minimal, and in the end you streamline everything, make it all white, and it looks smart for a while, but there's nowhere it can progress. It's a cul-de-sac. And I started looking at the Baroque artists, started studying them again, Borromini, and went around looking at the churches and finding a richness again that somehow we had lost through ornament, through layers of design. So there was always and then the Gothic cathedrals, some of the beautiful ones that have a primary vault and the secondary and the tertiary. So some were ornament, and then I studied a lot of ornament, classical books written about 1890 to 1920, Germans mainly, and realized that actually we had lost something. And then I began to realize, partly also through study of chaos theory and various things, that this is my theory, it's totally personal, so it's not so much the work has influenced me, I came to a certain decision about who we are, and that the new humanism is to take away from tectonic form and go into pattern making. Now, doing that and talking about that in 98, I was derided because pattern was a bad word in architecture. It was seen as decorative. I never saw it as decorative. I saw it as fundamentally an organization principle. And I began to believe that we had resonance with certain complex pattern because we are not simple. And I started studying, my son did biology, so I started studying DNA. I looked at everything and came to realization that the world is complex, not difficult, just complex. And you have to take it in its widespread together. You cannot cut. You can cut and look for simplicity to progress a bit, but it's not real. The reality is something else. And so I decided that fractals and things like that had resonances with us, and if I could find the harmony, more to do with the eye intersecting the form. So the serpentine is deliberately agonizing decision on the size of that steel plate. The algorithm's the easy bit. What size is the steel plate? And the thickness, and what intersection. And the rhythm of intersection does something, I believed. And it was proof because no one wanted to leave that. When they had corporate events in the night, nobody wanted to go. And now I've put it up in Saint-Tropez for a rich client as a restaurant in Saint-Tropez, same thing. Nobody wants to leave when they're there. So, and good for him. So I have a belief that, and I haven't got to it, it's no answer. It's just an exploration of my psyche in relation to what I believe is out there, a complex interwoven web of things. And numbers have given me a certain insight. That's why I look, nothing else.
Okay, we've got one question from the front and then man at the back. We'll go to Kat first.
Hi, Kat.
And thank you for education into numbers and the beauty of numbers and the beauty of the forms that they generate. And I wanted to ask if in terms of the way that you saw numbers as a material, also if you saw colours in that kind of similar way, because I was really struck by the choices of colours that you made and your use of colours. And I wondered if you play the same idea of games and organising principles and harmony as well.
Yeah, I do. I haven't shown you. I have those numbers in colour forms and colour wheels and animations that colour. And colour for me is material, absolute material. I also learned that when, in a visceral way, when I was working with Anish Kapoor on the Marsyas, the sculpture at the Tate, modern, 2002, I think. We picked a red, as he picks red, that's his colour. And that's fine. I was doing the form, and he picked the red. But I remember hanging the red up in his studio, and it just didn't look right. It looked weak. And then we looked at the color palette. And in fact, at one time, we were making Marsyas in silver, which would have been sensational because I had a form that actually spanned the gallery, but as it came to the middle, it bifurcated horizontally as well. So there was a narrative of the stretch, but there was a narrative this way. And the bulge in mirror fabric was absolutely stunning. And Nick Sarota and everybody just said, great. But again, when we hung the fabric, it started to crease and any blemish looked bad. So then we went back to the red, but by shifting the color palette, suddenly we picked a maroon red. and it just suddenly gave body to the piece. It actually fleshed it out. So there was another proof the color is totally, and then that's why, before that experience, I did a book called Informal, and I took a bold decision to color the book. So the book has 12, I think 8 or 10 chapters, and each chapter is one color. There's a blue chapter, a yellow chapter, a green chapter, and that was, you know, posing problems to the publisher. But I stuck to my guns, and you know, and the book won many, many awards, 8 awards for design, including Bannister Fletcher Award for Best Book on Architecture in England. So color, and it did. There's something in that book. The color punches you. It does something. You're reading the narrative, you're reading the diagrams, but the yellow background, say the V&A chapter is yellow. The fractals are yellow. It does things. Yeah, so color absolutely is material. For me, according to the number grids, the numbers power any characteristic or attribute. Smell, heat. I mean, I got heat gradients on those numbers, which look wonderful when you look at them. The color spectrum moving through the numbers. That's why I think of resin and the color drifting through. Can be done.
Right, there's a question right at the back.
My understanding is that at one point you were studying classical guitar, and that you have a profound love of music. And I was just wondering whether you could say to what extent you drew or are drawing your experience of number and sequence and pattern and harmony, perhaps dissonance.
I think everything. I haven't shown you some of the work when the very early work I did was translating Bach cantatas and running numbers, because Bach is the most geometric of composers, an amazing genius beyond genius, because he somehow through simple organization rules made, you know, unbelievable music. So I studied his cantatas, some of his early work, and positioned them into numbers and bar code, provided it actually looked something like the prime numbers. Music, yes. I mean, I play a lot of music. I did a lot of guitar as well. And I think my mother was a classical pianist, and I grew up in her womb listening to Chopin. So I think it's inherent in me, and the serialization of music, the sequence. And in the book Informal, I write a manifesto based on 3 attributes: melody, juxtaposition, which is rhythm, and harmony, hybrid. The 3 characteristics of my classification of a contemporary model of organization is locality, juxtaposition, and hybridity. That is the complex world we are in. No one category. But they are the attributes of music, with melody, rhythm, and harmony. And in jazz, which is really an ultimate form of exploration of soundscapes, under the masters, it's an amazing journey of musical compilation of ratio, getting to certain harmony points and moving around it. So I listen to a lot of jazz as well. And I mean, who knows, you know, all my life I've been listening to music every day. So it's in it, you know, it's in there for sure. And my language, my native language, is a kind of curvilinear script. And again, I didn't think this, but a critic years ago looked at and he saw something in Sinhalese that I'd written, and he said, "Oh my God, I understand your work now." I mean, I didn't know. So who knows, you know, your personal growth and influences your cultural product. I mean, what we're doing is a cultural product when we design. And the sieve that is in our brain that we come through organizes these deep cultural roots in us. But because of also scientific training to some extent, I can override the mystical and put together sort of the rational and the irrational together and sort of go forward. And I think that is what makes the number world interesting as well. The best compliment I had for number 9, or the best critique, was it's a completely rational book, but at the end of it, it's totally irrational. I love that. It's one comment that came which I loved, and some critic wrote it. Because it is. All of this stuff, if you look at it closely, doesn't make sense.
Question in the middle from Alison.
Thank you. I wonder if you look back at the whole trajectory of your work, is it surprising to you now that you didn't get to making sculpture before, without going through the numbers?
Totally. Yeah. When I I started working with Anish Kapoor in, I think, 2000, millennium. And he said, "Oh my God, you're the first person I've met who's a complete sculptor." And that was a nice compliment, in that he had worked, I thought, or tried to work with other people or done things. And of course, it's not a surprise. You know, I dealt with structure and form, dealt with architectural form, and what is it but sculpting in a way? What I do like about sculpture, and I regret not doing it earlier, is that it has no function in one way, in a literal sense. So I don't have to think about toilets, stairs, drainage, doors, door swings left to right. You can just go for it, which is wonderful and really frees me. And I'm very happy that we have now 8 public art sculpture on the go in America. All won recently, a major work. So I would love to have done it before. I've always painted and drawn and sketched, but never made objects in the name of art. I made buildings and tried to get the poetic out of the building through material, through its joinery, through its connectivities. Spent hours on a boat group, what's the right optimum, but not pure sculpture for its own sake, and I'm enjoying it, absolutely. Needed to live another 20, 30 years.
Right, so I think we'll draw things to a close now, and just outside of here, as you exit, there'll be drinks just to the left before you go down the stairs. But just a very quick vote of thanks to both the Peter Dormer Lecture Committee and all the committee members that are here today, to the chair of the committee, or the co-chair, Tanya Harrod and Hans Stouffer, and to the friends and family and donors to the Peter Dormer Lecture Committee, in particular Jane Smith, Helen Drott English, worthy of special mention, and also to the Royal College of Art, and particularly the Jewellery and Metal Department for hosting tonight and welcome us here to the Royal College of Art. And finally to Cecil for what I hope you agree has been a very good lecture. Please give a good round of applause and join us for drinks outside.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.